Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk, and of course I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and their neighbours, the Boonwurrung. Actually, this is Boonwurrung land, I think, this side of the river. And of course, that's very important that we acknowledge that, and particularly in policy, because Australian policy around Aboriginal health has been varied and vexed over many, many years. And I think it would be kind of easy and simplistic to say now that we're on a sure footing, but we're probably anything but that. I think, politics around that continues to evolve, and our discipline has got a great deal of work and heritage working in this space, trying to improve Aboriginal health. Not an easy ask. So I'm going to talk a little bit about policy in general terms, and mindful that you've got exams coming up. I was kind of thinking on the way in, what's the easiest mnemonic to remember this by? Like, what's the bit that you could take away? I'm going to talk in general terms about policy development, so to say. Rob and I have worked together over many years, but Rob's going to go into a bit deeper dive on a couple of lived examples that he's worked closely on, and we might conclude as well on an example where we've both worked together at a number of different levels, particularly on salt policy. But we can also run this in a more seminary way. I've got a couple of slides. Rob doesn't have any slides, so happy to make it as useful as it is going to be for you. When I think about this, and I've been working in various forms in policy environments for about 20 years now, roughly speaking, both in the UK and in Australia. And when when I got a question, can you come and talk about policy? I literally go, what even is that? Like, what is policy, right? And it made me think, the easiest mnemonic I would have to describe what I do as my job currently and in past roles and in policy in general would be all around the P's. So you're talking about people, you're talking about power, you're talking about politics, and you're talking about process. So there's four basic things there. Now, that ain't from one you fancy learning books. That's a nugget of Bolam, quote, Bolam nugget, 2019, sack me if you find ones which clearly aren't captured in that simple denomination, but it's easy to remember, right? And when I say people, what I mean is this, a $2 coin. What makes us different to all other species on the planet is our ability to cooperate around a socially constructed reality. Money has no inherent worth. You cannot eat it, you cannot, do all sorts of things, but it will determine your lifestyle chances in human society. Why? Because using language, we cooperate and we structure our cooperation implicitly and explicitly to create dreamed realities, faculties, laws, governments, nations, and money, all are socially constructed. It strikes me as ironic that many of the people who argue the most vehemently with the old kick of the table analogy of I'll look at your social reality, Bolam, I'll kick my table, that table's real, your social reality doesn't exist. The most cynical people are usually the people who are the most concerned with money. But what is money? It is purely a social construct. It did not exist, in fact, as a core construct in human experience until probably a couple of thousand years ago, or a few thousand years hence, but prior to that, of course, it was all just barter economy, right? So we were just figuring out, then we created this thing, and it's the creation of these social realities which enables us to manufacture a reality. So when we're talking about people in public health or in policy, we're really talking about how we construct a social reality. Now, a social reality is unique because a social reality, while fixed, is also potentially very rapidly amenable to change. And anybody who's watching what's happening in the US with Trump and thinking about, for example, US political institutions, like the demarcation of power, the way in which in the law over there you should separate out the economic interests of the president from the politics, etc., 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 we'll see how these dandelion-like have been wafted aside by the sweep of a new president in the US. So social reality determines life chances, but is also amenable to change. That is the creation of the opportunity for policy, right? That is the creation of the opportunity for what we're trying to achieve in our goals. So that's the bit about people. The next bit then is about power. Power to control resources. That's fundamentally it. Who owns what? Who has the right to choose to control a given resource? Money, blah, 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 the power to control violence within society legitimately through the exercise of police or through the exercise of war, etc., etc. Who controls the power? The next bit is about politics. Politics, again, the definition of which is highly, highly variable. My definition of politics is equals tribe. Which tribe gets to exercise power on what thing? Who gets to make those calls and who's in control? Because power is always contested. It is a competition for resources. And somebody at some point is a relative winner relative to others. And politics, in many respects, and one of those definitions of politics, is about the science of choices, which is an extension of economics, in a way. You know, it's about control of resources, who gets to control it, which tribe. Then the final bit is process. So how do we manufacture a consensus around a given thing that enables it to then occur in whichever way? So you've got people, which equals social construction. You've got power to control resources. You've got politics, as in which tribe is running that particular issue. And then finally, you've got process. How is that created? So when we think about policy, we tend to think about policy as a point of principle, which basically a statement of principle, and usually those statements of principles actually come from a value base. They normally come from a value position. Most of us, I'm sure, in here would say human rights, yes. Bad news, human rights is a social construct. Human rights didn't exist until, what, when was it? Human rights in the WHO, about 1947, even later than that, as a construct, right? So one of the core things that we're using to drive work globally, social construct, it's a statement of principle. And in actual fact, it's a statement of value. It's a value statement, right? It's not a pure empirical standpoint. It's a value proposition. And that's what's really interesting with politics and policy. Most people, when they make decisions, do not make decisions rationally. They make decisions largely on the basis of instinct and on the basis of value-based decisions. It's much more about what the value that you're promoting is than rationally laying out, this is the best way ahead. What Trump is offering to people is make America great again. There's a sense that our nation is deteriorating. We want to rise it up. We want to do that. Well, that's great. Now, did anyone go to the prevention conference this weekend up in town? Yeah, Michelle made it too. There was, ironically enough, prevention conference, foodborne outbreak at the conference. Yeah, of all the places to get a food from, it was the salmon mousse. I'm not sure, hadn't been confirmed yet. Yeah, the second day was like of all of the places, this is going to be very thoroughly investigated.
Transit and already track the problem of salmonella injuries in the poultry industry. It's set to shut it down, the whole poultry industry, which of course is going to be a problem when we shut the porcine industry down with African swine fever.
That's another thing. So I'll wrap up in a sec to let Rob take the stage with his worked examples. But which is when it comes to life, of course. Yeah. But we think about statements of principles. We think about value propositions. There's a great presentation by Vic Health. It'll be published on their website soon. A piece of research looking at value proposition testing. So giving different people messages on public health, and particularly testing this value proposition. If you've never heard it before, public health, here come the Nazis with their jackboots on, nanny state, out of control, telling us how to live our lives. Tony Abbott, nobody gets to choose what goes in my mouth other than me. Direct quote, more or less. Anyone heard that argument? We've had that argument. Everyone heard the nanny state argument. Now, what they did in the value proposition testing is they said, okay, you've got about 17% of the people 13% who are baked on, they are not going to buy the value proposition of public health. Full stop, right? Don't even try and convert them. As soon as someone rolls out the nanny state, back off, no point. They're baked on, ain't going to work. Then you've got 17% who are the baked on supporters. Us lot. Get it? Well, why wouldn't we do it? You'd have to be crazy not to do it. Then in the middle, 60-odd%, who are the swing voters. Now, what's interesting is how you can test out what people respond to in the specific framing. As soon as you say, we want to enable healthier choices, make healthier choices, easier choices, that emphasis on choice brings people's attention to their agency. And their agency is very close to their heart, right? You know, everybody wants to believe that you've got agency and control over your life, and that it shouldn't be getting interfered with. Actually, one of the strongest value propositions through the Vic Health research that came through is the social justice argument. This is in an Australian context. I don't think it would necessarily play the same way internationally. But interestingly enough, when you talk about it's not fair that people's postcodes determine their health. Huge support for your neutral swing voter. It's a great value proposition, okay? So, and that's coming from a value perspective. It's not a rational, you're not presenting like a 15 document meta-analysis. You're presenting a value proposition. With climate change, it's the same basic thing, right? We've got a whole bunch of people who believe the science. Who in here has actually read the science? Maybe some people have. Good on you. Most people who would say they support it haven't sat down and read the UN reports on it. They take it as read and they get the value proposition. But the resistors are responding to a different value proposition, which is we don't want to be bossed around, we don't want to be told what to do by a bunch of, liberal elite, boffins taking away jobs, right? So they're different value propositions. So a statement of principle is a statement of policy. Usually it's an authoritative statement made by a person or a body of some description, deemed to have legitimate authority. Sir Humphrey, this is a reference to, what was that show? Yes, Minister, yeah. Yeah, so stage 1, say nothing's going to happen. Stage 2, say something may be going to happen, but we should do nothing about it. Stage 3, say maybe we should do something about it, but there's nothing that we can do. Stage 4, say maybe there was something we could have done, but it's too late to do anything. This is a great example of how and it's obviously a very cynical example, but a lot, if you look at your 4 Ps, right, and you think about power, about as much about having power can be about retaining power as actually doing anything else, right? And one of the most effective ways of maintaining power is just get to the top of the tree and just stay there, right? Yeah? And sometimes that means just riding stuff out, riding things out, letting things tick over, just trying to do risk mitigation all different ways in order to ensure your position. The formal policy lot cycle, and there are many of these written up, this is just one example. Often these examples will start with the process of thinking around consulting, creating a problem, thinking about what a given problem is, consulting on that, forming policy options, consulting further on that, thinking through policy options and analysis, what are the pros, what are the cons, weighing those up, further consultation, take it up to some form of decision-making body, make the decision, move forward. So a fairly traditional modernist kind of narrative of, forming up a problem and moving through a cycle. And there's certainly problems that fit that cycle in public health. And I think many of the most solvable problems in public health come from being complex and get done through this. They get turned from being a complex, poorly defined issue into a concrete value proposition, which is a solvable problem, right? It goes from being a socio-political issue to being a technical issue, right? We know that the underlying issues around Ebola are socio-political. There's a lot of infectious disease stuff in there too, but the reasons why people are getting it and dying from it are socio-political and economic, right? We're not getting Ebola here, and that's not just because we don't have some of the vectors, it's because we've got a completely different architecture socially and economically, right? We know that, but the solution that gets rolled out is a highly technical one and is not disputed. Most people are absolutely scared to their wits' end by the prospect of Ebola, and we will happily fund and roll out responses to that because we can see a technical solution to that particular issue. Now, actually, we know that the long-term solution needs to be socio-economic, etc., 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 but that's a complex problem that goes beyond the ken of normal policy processes. A lot of the time, it's about taking a wicked problem or a complex problem and boiling it down to something which is technically solvable. You, in your jobs, will often be brought in as those technical people, right? But you'll know that many of the issues are wicked problems, but the solutions you'll need to serve up often need to present in quite a technical way for it to be compelling, for it to get real buy-in, decision-making wise. This is a boiled-down version of that. So what's the problem to start off with? Now, that problem, we use epidemiology. That's the core of our thing, right? But to a politician, what's the problem? The problem can be a stakeholder. The problem can be a constituent with a particularly sad story. Rosie Batty is a great example. Rosie Batty and her son Luke, Luke died through family-based violence, through the murder by the father. Rosie Batty's story and Rosie Batty as an individual changed hearts and minds, right? The issue of family violence and of men's violence against women and kids has been in place for many years, right? But what turned in that was an individual narrative and a pivot point. Again, it goes back to that fundamental thing about how we respond to each other as human beings. So you've got an issue, You identify options, you consult on those options, there is some form of political decision made, it's implemented, and then, and this would be nice, it gets evaluated. Often you'll be brought in to do the evaluation. I am a great advocate for evaluation, right? I've worked as an academic for many years myself, never going to argue against evaluation. The challenge is decision making is typically, predates what the evaluation findings are going to be. It's going to be determined on the basis of, a variety of different factors which often fall outside of the criteria on that are formally being evaluated. My easiest way of thinking about this is this, which is basically that I've never, when somebody wants to do something, I've never been asked to provide the evidence for it. As soon as somebody wants to not do something, the first thing I get asked for is the evidence, right? That's the relative position of evidence in these kind of pieces, right? The evidence is your friend, is your ace in your hand, right, of your cards, but you can still get outplayed in a game of poker, even if you've got a nice ace in your hand, right? You want that ace in your hand, but certainly do not believe that the evidence is going to carry the day. If it did, we'd be living in a very different world. Oops. That's an idealised model, and so as you've got from me blathering on so far, and what Rob's going to illustrate more deeply now, is that much policy making is actually pragmatic. It's far more opportunistic than that cycle would allude to, and it's far less rational in a formalised sense, with less well-defined goals often than alluded to in that cycle. An alternative approach is being described by Kolbach, which basically argues that rather than it being a cycle, there are vertical and horizontal dimensions to policy development. The vertical is the formal decision-making structure of government. So that's what we just described. Me, I'm a policy bod, I work in a department, I'm asked to write a paper for cabinet, which I'm writing at the moment. Me and my team come together, we write the paper, we put it up the chain, it gets approved by everybody up to the secretary, then the minister, then it goes over the cabinet, they have a conversation, it comes back. Perfect value chain, up and down and across the parts of government. Then there's another approach there, which is about a horizontal process of negotiating and bargaining between the players in that process. So rather than it just being purely up and down, there's an appraisal and conversation running across the way, and then everyone in that process has got their own interests. They've got their own wins and losses out of any potential decision that might flow, and Rob will be talking about that in more detail. Therefore, policy development becomes an iteration between these two processes, formal authorization and horizontal negotiation between the different interest groups. Evidence-based policy is no substitute for thinking-based policy. Right? Often, when we come to a policy decision or a policy decision made, and more often than not, to be quite honest, I see decisions not being made rather than being made. A policy decision implies that somebody has the power to make a decision. Often that's not the case. Even the minister will often feel inhibited in relation to decision. It's easier to kick a can down the road and say, let's do a review on that. We definitely need to write a consensus statement. That is an imperative piece for us to form a consultative committee on. I.e., kick it down the can down the road. It's too hard, goes into the too hard basket, right? So you just kind of delay and move along. Often we're arguing from a first principles basis. Evidence is the ace in your hand. I will always argue that, and there is no point to public health or saying that we are different than anybody else unless we are referring to the evidence, right? But evidence isn't going to get us all the way there, and it's our job to try and get as much evidence in as possible, but always assume that no evidence is the normal state of affairs, right? I don't want to sound cynical in that. Most decisions in life are not based on evidence. Why have kids? Not a great evidence-based decision, right? But it's not. It's a terrible idea. If you look at the empirical evidence in terms of net benefit, blah, 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 dreadful idea. Doesn't stop anybody having kids, right? Why? Because the value proposition is there. So don't get hung up. Like, the evidence can't answer many of the questions. Life is not an RCT. We don't actually know huge swathes of stuff. We shouldn't let that inhibit us to be making our value proposition and putting our thinking and our rationality and our logic right up front. And that's what's driven public health for many, many decades. So that's my basic blurb, giving you some background. Now handing over to Rob.
I'm going to go off, talk off this one. So in answer to the children one, I often say the evidence is resounding with the fact that you wouldn't do it again. But the thinking-based part is that you wouldn't give them back. Because, being the proud owner now, my youngest is 20, and my oldest, my son, is a great drinking buddy at the pub. This is fantastic. It's, it's like the new age, but bigger kids, bigger problems. So I've been through those too. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of where policy doesn't work or hadn't worked, and where it actually has worked. And Bruce and I are going to share our joint loved experience of SALT strategy, where we think we actually might have done something. So if we think about the issues identification, I'm sitting out in Natimuc, which is west of Horsham, as a GP running my own practice, plus doing public health work, both for the local division of general practice, and I'm also on the board of General Practice Victoria, which was the auspicing body for the divisions of general practice when we were still organising where things were sitting. What I was in the middle of was an epidemic. A farmer was killing themselves every week from during the Great Drought. So there's some urgency in the community, and a way of actually trying to garner and organise what's happening at the local level about what was going on. But what I'm also facing is there was no mental health services from the so-called state-funded services. They stopped at Ballarat, and they did not reach the people that were sitting out there. So I was facing psychotics to various degrees. I was having death threats from some of those, 1 in 1,000 that are really particularly nasty, working closely with the police and other things like this at local level for my own personal protection, but also the protection of my community. So these are sort of I'm sitting there right in the cold face doing this, but find myself in a position as on the board of General Practice Victoria, being asked to go on to a mental health task force in the state. So this is okay, the state's trying to develop a mental health policy. This is John Brumby's government at that stage, and there's a junior parliamentary secretary of health, a fellow called Dan Andrews, you might have heard of, who's sitting in that post. He hadn't reached ministry at that level yet. So we set about bringing in all the stakeholders, but behind this, the evidence had come from the burning fire in the valley here. This is bad. This is not supposed to happen. And having a community behind me with local government screaming about people are dying in our community and this is not right. The unfortunate thing about people with serious mental illness is they don't want the care because they're deluded, but they need the care. Their families are torn to shreds. So it's actually a difficult population like Margaret was talking about. These are like, they don't have a right sort of stuff. That's the problem. We end up segmenting into domains because this is what you have to do. This is a big problem. We look at early childhood development, so postnatal development or even antenatal development, all the preceding stuff. We've got to look at that. We've got to look at early childhood. Where does that fit? What happens to early childhood psychiatric care or resilience building? We then move into young adults where it really hits its prime. So we'd already had some evidence on some of the early intervention programs for psychosis and that, but they were just pocketed little dots across the state. We then moved into intractables with long-term chronic care. We also moved into high prevalence conditions. But underpinning all of this were the theorems of how do we actually make something happen. So we've got community outrage, which we've got to garner, and we garnered that really well. In the drought area, we had CWA and Victorian Farmers Federation arguing for us, not the health sector, for money, and we got it. We got it under Federal Minister Wooldridge at that stage with some money poured through in drought relief areas, but that's not the solution to the mental health problem. So what did we end up with? We ended up with possibly the group that I was sitting on, which was governance and accountability, because what I'd done was interrogate the problem. Where were the blocks for evidence being translated? Where were the blocks for, in fact, sensible, reasonable care and access to care being blocked? And that was, in fact, in people not doing what they were being paid to do. That is accountability. But then there were not the measures. So the governance accountability was the right one. We had people who were CEOs of community health centres. We had others who were actually community mental health people, and myself representing primary care, who had experiences in measurement and evaluation of where it was. So we set about clear goals that actually need to be set. This got presented to, the Premier was running this, so it got presented to the Premier and endorsed, but it was endorsed before the budget cycle, and we knew it was dead. Because the thing of understanding the mechanics of government, as Bruce knows so well, you've got to be in on the budget cycle to actually do that. And I knew it had gone. Serendipitous, well, actually, no chance. I'm standing in Natimuc outside having a chat with the local policeman outside the milk bar, and I didn't know that Community Cabinet was going to nil. And they were driving through my town. Natimuc's got 760 people in it, okay? we're standing there, me and the policeman, and both of us are troubled by mental health because we're the mental health force, dealing with all the serious mental health illnesses out there. He pulls the gun out on them, and I write the sections 33s or 2s or whatever they were at that stage, and so throw them in the van, mate, take them out of here. Brumby hops out of the car, comes over to say good day. I don't think he recognised who I was because I wasn't dressed in the suit and tie that I was when I do high-level government work. And I go, you know what, Premier? I'm a bit disappointed the fact that this didn't get funded. He said, what do you mean? We've endorsed it. And I said, you know darn well that this isn't going to get funded. He said, look, I was Treasurer once, but even as Premier, I still have to actually convince Treasury to actually enact because it's all about the money and the return on investment. And I said, I realised that we actually didn't do enough work on return on investment for what it would mean if we had a mentally health stable, resilient and promoting state. He said, those are good words, Rob. And I said, yeah, I know. I wish I'd written them in the start of the document. Because that's actually what they actually want. That's what the Premier wants. And what Treasury wants is what Margaret was showing you, exactly all the returns on investment that you get with regards to money coming into the bank. So that's where we failed as policy writers from the outside and the perspective of where it came from. So if we fast forward now, we've got a Royal Commission. So what submission do you think I put into the Royal Commission? It was pretty damn simple. It was about 3 lines. I think you should pull out the documents that we did for Premier Brumby and enact them. That's the end of my submission to the Royal Commission. Because I feel that if people are held to do what they're actually paid to do, that things would actually start to change. Then the next thing is actually mapping service to demand. Margaret had great examples. Take the care to the people. Don't bring the people to the care. And look what happens. It's miraculous. It actually works. And mental health is no different to that. So I really do view some degree of hope with regards to the Royal Commission outings, but this is a long haul. I'm talking, I started in this space late 90s to now. You've got to stick in there and put your, I'm passionate about this area. I know the life stories of all these patients that I've dealt with. And I think in one sense, for us to actually look at the future state, we just have to keep fighting. Measure, share, accountability in this case. And the other one is the value proposition. We failed on that one by not, in fact, actually putting the Treasury, if you don't invest in this state's stuffed, which is essentially what Bruce was telling us. All right, so that's a negative downer, right? But it's a positive if we've got a Royal Commission, we can actually work on that. The positive story that I want to talk about is better cardiac care for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders. So my involvement here was when I was the clinical director at the Heart Foundation. We had an Indigenous unit as well, and we were funding a lot of Indigenous cardiovascular research, but it also gave me a connection to the greatest in this space. There was an enormous amount of evidence coming out about what's the gap caused by. And if you listen to, say, Alex Brown talk about the gap itself was largely cardiovascular. And we all know cardiovascular disease is, 1, treatable, and 2, it's actually preventable. So there's a really solid force there. And I think the closing the gap signatory and an argument actually allowed us to garner some strength across all state governments, and in particular federal government leadership. And I guess if we look at one thing that Tony Abbott did drive at that stage, it was in fact actually a passion for actually this area. It's very hard to look at his legacy in a positive light in any way, whatsoever, shape or form, but he did actually start to push in that area with regards to us driving it. And I sadly have to say that some of my best work's been done in a coalition setting, not telling you my colourist ballot box, but it seems to be the reality of my career. And it's going to have to happen in this next leg that I'm sitting in at the moment. So let's think about better cardiac care for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders. We knew down to the infinitesimal level what the problem was. People were not getting access to the care pathways. They were not getting actually the service in hospitals. We had some damning papers that we produced from the Heart Foundation funding that showed that you were about 60% more likely not to get evidence-based care as an Aboriginal person if you were admitted with acute coronary syndrome in a hospital. And I had to actually do a trench-by-trench battle on that with regards to teaching hospitals. Professors of surgery, everybody who comes to our hospital gets evidence-based care. It's because they choose to leave early. I'm going, I want you to reconsider what you just said. They choose to leave early.
what does that mean about the care that you're giving? It's not relevant to them. They're not engaged with that care. You should be actually asking yourself, what am I doing wrong? Because you're doing something wrong. Here are your figures for your hospital. So I guess in a sense the power of advocacy to get this stuff up, because we have to have these battles like that, because if we were going to put up a policy to improve Indigenous cardiovascular care in this country, we were going to get shot down from everybody else with their self-interests. So that's an example of the trench warfare you actually have to do to get change to happen, because I don't want the professor of cardiology at St Vincent's in Sydney or Royal Melbourne here actually saying, no, we're not doing this. This is not right, because they actually do have a lot of pull when it comes into the policy space. So you've got to be quite savvy about, I've got to start quelling my opposition. And from that point, we then actually garnered, what are we actually going to write? We had some performance metrics which we're going to put up through the Australian Health Ministers Council to be agreed to by COAG to in fact actually empower this to do. So when we talk about the evaluation, so most people were saying the political decision was close the gap, cardiovascular care's got to shut. The implementation, well, that's another story, but the evaluation was setting in the performance metrics, as I mentioned with the first one. We were not going to move on those. The performance metrics were, what are the admission rates of Indigenous people? What are the early discharge rates? And if you look at this as a piece of measurement, AIHW collects these figures, so you can see those. The sixth one was rheumatic heart disease rates. Now, this one was absolutely Rob at his most angry, because people kept trying to take it off the list. And I put it back on, and they take it off, and they put it on. So I'm going, at the last stage, Kerry Chant, Chief Health Officer at New South Wales, and myself were doing the presentation to ARMAC, Australian Health Ministers Council. Very formal thing. You've got all of the big notes from the states there, and they're all going to argue about why they're not going to do things and why they're going to do things. So we've done all our homework on all those levers to actually make them happy with what we're doing. The rheumatic heart disease was having solid opposition from New South Wales and Victoria. So I had the Chief Medical Officer from New South Wales presenting with me, and I'm still not completely sure that she's over the line with this one, right? We got it over the line. And now what's happening? So we look at successful policy implementation. States are now investing in rheumatic heart disease. Queensland's put money down. Others have, because they're measured. Victoria, shock horror, has the formative starts of a register with regards to that. They didn't want to do it, but, you know, we had Roscoe Taylor sitting in there, and Roscoe was pushing it from inside the department to actually do that. That's the hard work with policy, actually how you change it. Yeah, we've got to close the gap. That's the policy framework. But what does it look like as we break it down into those sort of areas? Rheumatic heart disease, possibly some of the biggest steps was rename it. I called it the national disgrace. And now Jonathan Karaputis from RHD is now calling it the national disgrace, because that's what it is. It shouldn't be in this country. So success, we've now got this that's turning. Alex Brown now sort of comes back to what's happening in NT and South Australia with cardiovascular. He said we've dropped the differential by 10% in cardiovascular. Was the last sort of figures from evaluating the effectiveness of actually doing this. So one of those is we've got the large level policy measures and metrics, and then down to that we've actually got state dollars going into programs that are actually doing things against the target. So that's sort of like a dream state. You know, if that was the last thing on my tombstone, I'll be happy about that. Now, I think we should move to the next one, Bruce, because I think Bruce and I started working on the food. What was the name of that group? It was the Food and Health Dialogue, I think. Food and Health Dialogue. Food and Health Dialogue. And in Victoria, Bruce was at Vic Health, and I was at the Heart Foundation. And I think I actually carried this even when I went over to Bupa to keep doing this work. Yeah. Bought the Bupa Foundation, put some funding into it. We cottoned on to food. Food's very complex because it's really got lots of bits and pieces of stuff attached to it. So we said, what's the easy one? Salt. Because too much salt, you get sick. Not enough salt, you get sick. But there's a happy medium. Sugar's really, really complex because, and that's why it's not inherently as easy to work with. But let's just get a bite-sized chunk. And I guess we had some favourable elements in the state government to ask us to actually look at food and food policy, about where we were. We were doing advocacy documents from the Heart Foundation perspective of how many tonnes of salt were being put into our processed food, and then having very good infographics about how many tonnes we could take out by looking at a regulation approach, or at least an enforcement approach, and a star system. But I don't know the context setting, Bruce, if you've got some other stuff you want to add, because you've got the other perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and certainly the evidence base comes really into play here, because salt, it's a component, right? It's a nutritional component, and the problem with food is that the basic guidance on food should be eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's basically it, right? If it doesn't look like food, it's going to be highly processed, i.e. full of salt, sugar, fat. If you're cooking it yourself, it's usually going to be better. Even if you're making a cake, it's usually going to be better for you than buying something which is shop-bought or pre-packaged, right? Mostly plants, speaks for itself. Only, I think, 4% of the Australian population eats enough vegetables every day, relative to the Australian dietary guidelines, 4%. And not too much, it speaks for itself, right? But that core basic message gets lost because of the complexity of food and because of the emotional attachment to food. So often we get into a nutritional war. Now, if I go to my little schema of power, politics, one of the challenges with salt is that because it's a nutrient thing, right? It's a solvable problem, and the UK work on this issue clearly demonstrated. And if you do a quick Google search, you'll see the papers reviewing that work. Through getting industry, processing food industry, to take salt out of the processing chain, particularly of products where a large volume of salt is intake, and that can be surprising things like bread, breakfast cereals, and a variety of other things. By doing that at source, they actually reduce salt intake and overall, I think is it diastolic or is it diastolic?
No, it was diastolic.
Diastolic down, yeah.
That was McDonald's study or McKinsey study.
Diastolic went down at a population level without anybody having to choose anything different. You just took the salt out and figured out a different way of processing the food, right? Now, that data is really, really compelling from the UK. We thought this would be something worthwhile looking at in Australia, and there was some support for that. But the problem definition and the power, like if we go to the beginning of the equation about people don't see there's a problem with salt. It was only seen as a problem in the UK as a social problem, basically because the Food Standards Agency was created by Blair back in about 1998, and they decided they were going to go after salt because it was a solvable problem. It was taking a complex system issue and turning it into a solvable problem. They did a lot of work, and they had the political support to do it. Here in Australia, salt hasn't really been recognised as a critical issue, and while we were trying to push the issues on salt, sugar has taken over the narrative. Right? So if you look in the papers, it's all about sugar tax. Interesting, that Vic Health research I was referring to earlier should be talking about a health levy rather than a sugar tax.
Nice.
Health levy.
So if we think about salt, why was salt added to food in the first place? We've reached a stage where salt, if we go back to colonial Australia, salt was vital because they wouldn't have So this is a public health intervention. So that $2 is going to a good cause, Bruce. So if we took salt out of food, it's to do with preservation of safety of food. So there's a food safety issue here as well. So the industry is pushing back on this, saying that, well, this is going to be a problem with regards to foodborne illnesses, as they may pertain with regards to reduction of salt in the food supply. But essentially, we had to actually also counter that by the fact that we actually do have other ways of preserving food, and there are other ways of maintaining integrity of food, and that a lot of the salt's been put in for taste and food experience and things like this to remove it. So there was an industry countenance to that. We had them involved, and from the Heart Foundation perspective, we worked quite closely with the Food and Grocery Council. Most people would say, oh, that's dreadful, how you're working with the enemy, but that's actually how you get things done. You really do need to work with across all sectors, and Food and Grocery Council certainly brought in the sales and the sales issues. So looking at this from a state issue, what can a state do? Because from how do you actually stop sales? Because you actually have to look at the whole food production cycle and about where those steps will come. There's going to be countenance from industry, there's going to be countenance from the distributors and the retailers, and there's going to be opposition everywhere. We went back to, and it's pleasing to see Rob down the back, we went back to what was done during the Tobacco Act, because a lot of that stuff looked at all those, addressing those issues. So they're public health policy principles
what's the enormity of the problem, what's going to stop me from actually getting my action through, what are clear and consistent guidelines. So our message was we need to decrease the amount of salt in processed foods. We need to decrease the amount of salt that is going into the retail sectors, and we can measure that. And are we actually going to see the health impact? We actually have to bear that on what the big studies have actually shown us in the past. We could set up evaluative frameworks if we liked. So where did we get with the salt issue? We certainly got a lot of voluntary removal of salt. The STAR system has actually, the evaluation of that at this stage, it's still not determined whether the development or the makeup of processed food has in fact actually decreased the amount of salt content in it. But the experience we had with the Heart Foundation TIC was that those that enrolled in the TIC program, they decreased their salt. So manufacturers can do it in that sort of setting. The government drive to do this, Victoria is one of the largest producers of food in the country, and certainly the processed food industry, so there's a significant lobby. Move that across to energy policy. The coal industry is very powerful. We're not. In the food area, if you've got something that's a significant revenue earner for the state, it's very important, so you actually have to look at and develop where they are. So where my role is now at CSIRO, I do have working with the food group that actually are working on some of these types of challenges about food production and making the food itself actually a healthier area. So I was going to stop because we've got about 10 minutes for questions about some of the things we've got, and Bruce will come back. But probably the finishing point that I always sort of like to put out is, as I mentioned from that, you've got to actually have it close to your heart. And I saw this T-shirt in the cover today, and I thought, so those who can't see it, I picked up, it says sugar kills. You have to wear your drivers at your heart and keep sticking at it. So with the mental health one, even though I don't work in that area at this stage, it's not going. Rheumatic heart disease, that's not going. I'm not going to stop on that. Because go to Tiwi or go up to Arnhem and see these little kids that are getting it and dying from it, and that shouldn't happen in this country. And as for healthy food for all of us, that's not going either. It's just that no one wants to fund it. And it's short of saying things have someone who works for the federal government. Unfortunately, we receive the only funding, and that's for the STAR system evaluation. That's the total spend on our nutrition policy in this country. Terrific. What's the leading cause of illness and death in this country? Taxes, I think, wasn't it? All right, questions about processor there. Hopefully I've sort of given you some heartfelt examples, and Bruce has given you some of the theory about where it fits. You've got a very valuable and important job.
When he gets back, and just before we go to questions, I might just try and bring that together, because I thought that worked really well, having the case studies alongside the theory, and just sort of, I guess, explaining why this is a nice clean circle, but really the complexities that are involved in terms of, the issues. We base what we think are an issue on evidence, but there's so much more to that. It's, it's the advocacy, it's what is in the media, it's what politicians think, and how do we influence what gets on the issue agenda in the first place, and develops the option to see the importance of consultation with all the different stakeholders. So, it's not just, politicians, but also industry. It's a really complex process, and engagement and consultation is a really important skill that we all have to have. The political decision that's really often the hard part to get over the line, in that you need someone up above to endorse it. And so I think it's also waiting for that window of opportunity, because sometimes things just align, and we want to have things ready, all this process ready for when that happens. And so Rob was saying it could take 20 years to get to that point, but it's good to have done all that and have it in the back pocket, so that when you get your window, you can put it forth and it can progress. Implementation takes money, so we have to not just get there, but we have to have the budget behind it, and then of course evaluation is always important. So I think this circle is nice and really clean to give you a framework, but there's lots of complexity that you need to think about behind it. So thank you very much for bringing that together for us. Do we have any questions for Bruce or Rob?
Any question. I think both of you touched on the complexity of the problem and calling it a wicked problem and dwindling it down to a simple problem that can be solved. But how do you decide that? And as much of what has happened, I guess, at a public health level, because we've whittled down complex problems and not addressed the breadth of complexity of the problem and maybe jump too quickly onto short-term solutions that can have the biggest gain.
Yeah, the trouble is our political cycles are short. I guess in Victoria now we've got a two-term government, almost a certainty, so this is where we need to be acting really hard to actually get things done. But with marginal governance like we've had federally for oh so long, no one's going to do anything that's long and legacy-wise. The next thing is, in fact, actually, I used to call it the bag of bolts that I used to carry into Parliament House with cardiovascular disease, and just knowing that as soon as someone tweaked on, okay, this one will fit, knowing that they're all part of whole, and knowing that they're not the total solution, and never confusing yourself that this is actually going to solve the whole problem, and also not promising that this would solve the whole problem. This will solve this, but it's part of this, but they'll only fund that bit. So it's very important to have all those, and I think, Catherine, you just said it well, you've got to have those things in your back pocket ready to go as to where they are. What do you think, Bruce?
Yeah, I totally agree, Rob. I think, and we've got Rob Grenfell at the back, Rob Moody at the back, so he might clarify it because he was on the group that pulled this particular piece together. But tobacco control, for example, works on multiple fronts. So you need legislation, you need taxation, you need social awareness, marketing, you need a whole bunch of components, and we know that works, right? And there's a way that the wealth evidence that shows that. But how are we going to turn around, tobacco smoking prevalence in Australia, for example? Well, sometimes opportunities will present, and then as Rob's suggesting, you've got to have a whole bag of tricks there of technical solutions, which potentially people you can serve up, and it always is going to come back to a sort of bit of a menu that then people can go, oh, that looks interesting. One of the things that had been on the menu in Australia for many decades was plain packaging of cigarettes, right? It was the last field of advertising for the product. And no one had gone there, everyone thought it was off the radar. Through the Preventive Health Task Force review work, which Rob was on, and a variety of other public health people were on, it was kind of refloated and amazingly got buy-in, right? Once that commitment was there, right, who's going to come back and change that law? Not even Abbott in his most ferocious was going to say, we're going to take that back, right? Now, there are many aspects of policy which can be taken back. You can have a little like that and the policy disappears, the funding disappears, X, Y, and Z. But with some institutional changes like that, once you've done them, they're fixed, they're going to go. And this is one of the single most famous things Australia's achieved, of course, in the last sort of 10 years or 15 years of public health achievement. So I think often we talk about policy windows, and you've just got to have a whole sequence of different technical fixes or things that present really sharply. I'll give you an example. Nude food. Anyone heard of nude food? Yeah. Nude food, it's a thing, right? The thing is kids' lunch boxes, right? Don't pack up in, so if you say nude food, it's better for the environment if your food isn't packaged. So try and make all the food that's in your kid's lunchbox not packaged, right? Really, really, really simple. The value proposition. No one's going to own the brand on that. It sells itself. The concept is written into the title of it, nude food. Quit. It's the same thing. The behaviour and the message tied into one. SunSmart, they bring together a really simple value proposition in a way which is compelling and which happens to find curry in a certain policy framework, and you run with that. But as Rob's alluding to, usually it's incremental. Very, very rarely do you go, oh, well, now we're going to have a multifactorial strategy which is going to tick all of the boxes. Yeah, very, very rare that happens.
Actually, it does. The cancer strategy here in Victoria is an example of full implementation of policy, and we've now got the dream state. I've seen in my time as a doc that I was actually on the NHMRC Health Advisory Committee doing the guidelines for breast cancer management back in the early 2000s. My patients were not getting evidence-based care out in the Wimmera Mallee because I couldn't get them into the system. Now, you get evidence-based care in this state unless you fight against it. That's actually an example of a good translation. Tobacco, the answer to that, in your back of your bolts. We're sitting with Rowan Greenland, who was Governance Relations at Heart Foundation, and myself. We're sitting with Nicola Roxon, and she was asking, Minister of Health, and she's saying, oh, what else could I put in the budget? The budget bid. And so she's just done the most Herculean thing of the plain packaging. We said, why don't you cut the duty-free allowance for cigarettes? Okay, this was one of the bolts that was in our pocket. Bam, why don't you do that? That'll save you XX, blah, 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 blah. We had the paragraph straight on. She goes, yeah, let's do it, and did it. Now all my smoking friends hate my guts because they're going to be come back with 2 packets down. I say, suffer in your lungs. It's did we create that evidence? No, that evidence was in our pocket, and we were ready to actually go. Here it is, costed for you, ready to go. That's how this game works. So we know the whole tobacco policy. We know how to do everything if we would, but we can't because there's constraints. Yep.
Bruce, I wanted to bring up your point about the kind of how embedded good policy can become and how it can be difficult sometimes for those things to get backtracked, and kind of ask you where, because I kind of think the forces seeking of kind of policy attrition often work in the same way as the forces trying to put together a policy. It's the same kind of thing. You do it in bits and bobs. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there was a group of executives in Philip Morris International sitting in some boardroom thinking about how we can slowly over time take back plain packaging. So where does policy protection as a force kind of sit within all of this? And in terms of your bolts kind of analogy, where does it sit kind of in your bag?
I'm in this space right now with vaping. Working at CSIRO, we do government documents that don't see the light of day. So there is that's been referred to in Hansard as the CSIRO document on the evidence against vaping. Whilst not released for general release, it's pretty simple. It's pretty bleedingly obvious, as Margaret said, for bleedingly obvious. Thanks, Margaret. That is, vaping makes children smoke. Shock horror. Oh, and now we're finding papers that vaping also causes endothelial damage. Because of course it is. You're putting a noxious chemical into your lungs. The forces behind there, just in the last 2 weeks, Larry Marshall, my boss, has received 2 evidence-based accounts of the good of vaping from Philip Morris, no less. And so you're damn right. These people are actually whittling at the back. But I would probably say your answer there. I'll let you answer the policy one, but they will never stop. My other passionate area is fertility rights or reproductive rights. I've worked in that area with Murray Stokes and others, and our biggest win was A486 listing on the PBS. And and the right to abortion, which is a human right, not a health right. These types of things are always being whittled, and we need the next generation to take on the fight that I sort of inherited from some of the other great fighters and just fight in the background, because you have to do it in the background, because the lobbies against you are vicious, and you need to do it as a collective. And so I'm willing to take on the next disciples to take this issue on, because it's there and needs to be fought. It doesn't have to be women, it can be men as well, because this one will never go away. Because I've been doing a lot of work in Georgia, states.
Look, I think in the little typology that I did of people, power, politics, tribalism, it comes into the power category. So ultimately, the thing that makes it impossible for something to occur is that it will cause too much outrage, either in a given interest group or within a given community of interest, place or person, people, identity, or just for the mass of people. So if we think about any kind of structural change, I think probably the best example, recently, is the failed Labour bid to get rid of negative gearing. Right? So if you get negative gearing plus the stuff around the franking dividends, right? Huge pushback from a particular stakeholder group. It's just seen as really, really bad politics. Now, you can slice it in all sorts of different ways, blah, 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 but the reality is, once you've brought in a law like negative gearing, it's pretty much impossible to change, and this last election has clearly demonstrated that, right? So it's kind of baked on. It's pretty difficult to do. We haven't lived through a war in Australia. We've lived in wars elsewhere. We've never had in the modern era, in the modern era, right? So we haven't seen that. If you lived in East Germany over the last 80 years, you could have lived in the Weimar Republic, an empire before that, East Germany, and a unified Germany, and Nazism, all within your lifetime, right? The fundamental changes that have happened in East German society, even just over an 80 or 90-year period, are massive. So nothing is not goable. Everything's up for grabs. But in an Australian context, not so much in a global context. I think those are quite different contexts. In Australia, broadly, pretty affluent, pretty stable, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of things which go into it becomes impossible because Well, what's the famous quote? Australia, the lucky country. But the bit that nobody talks about is with second-rate politicians. That's actually in that quote. It's actually the quote is because the point is the reason that it's a lucky country is because you've got a population a third the size of California on a continent. You'd have to be utterly incompetent for this nation not to advance. Like you really have to be actively working against your own self-interest to possibly fail, right? In that context, right? Actually, mostly the job, arguably, is keep the lunatics in the asylum. I.e., let the politics roll out. It kind of doesn't matter, Whichever way it's going to blow, the underlying conditions are good. So we're going in the right direction. Well, frankly, it's part of the reason why I live here, right? Look at Brexit.
I reflect on this one here. If you haven't got the back copies of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, you do need to watch it. It's mandatory for anyone who wants to work in this area. And the other one is The Hollow Men. The first episode of The Hollow Men was on the obesity strategy. And I think, Rob, you and Jane Martin had a bit to do with writing the script for that. It's a killer. And I can remember sitting my first time as a senior medical advisor in the health department here when I was given a job in there, sitting with the secretary, and I started to smirk. It was actually a particularly distasteful area, but she said, "What are you smirking about?" And I said, "I'm in the episode of The Hollow Men at the moment." She sat there. This is Fran Thorne. So Fran sat there and she thought, "Yeah, I can see that." Now, that's actually what happens. This guy was right. And for you to understand about how things, the trading and things that goes around, and when your blood pressure should rise and when it shouldn't, is watch those. And Utopia, of course, is just gold. That's been written by department officials as well. So anyone who wants to have a career in this space, that's real.
I'm not going to repeat that in the slightest.
One very last question, that's all right, and then we might move on.
Thanks, great presentation. I was just wondering what kind of opportunities do community play, particularly in Aboriginal health in the policy cycle, and I guess what are the realities?
Yeah, Rob's the person.
Okay, so one thing that I've been driving in CSIRO is we've got 10 business units, so there's energy, there's land and water, oceans, atmosphere, space, mine, which is health and biosecurity. I've thrown in the development of a business case for an Indigenous science program. Now, New Zealand's got one, and the idea there is to, let's call it first Australian scientists. There's 60,000 years of heritage on land management, far better than anything we've ever done, that we could actually learn from. But there are the other cultural issues about where science fits in with the science model that we've actually got in our head. We're doing that through a community development, community participatory model. Now, this is actually, again, I guess, sort of state-of-the-art theorem. That is, the community is driving that. We've got key people doing that, rather than us as well-meaning, educated white people trying to actually impose our theorems and design across this. That's actually difficult. The other thing, the rheumatic heart disease, why that's started to work as well from the groundswell. When I went to Bupa, I funded a awareness program called Take Heart. Great program, check it out on the web. The community invited us to come and put that in. It wasn't the health sector or the education sector through the government or supported programs. It was the community, the elders, the leaders saying, we want this on our community. It's very hard to reach that point. When you look at, say, dispossessed people that you deal with in most Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders who are dispossessed in the sense of where their land is and where they're belonging, it's hard to work out what the community is and where the community might be. Examples that I worked with in Horsham, the Watchabolic mob managed to get the only land rights in Victoria, and I worked at the clinic in Horsham with them when Uncle Jack was proud to have actually got this. What that means to the young men, what that means to the young women, what that means to actually access to their lands for their own cultural rights. That's important. How do you garner that when people are actually dispossessed and fighting is still the mystery. Great communities like Tiwi, East Arnhem, or even for that matter up around Fitzroy Crossing, they can actually do these things because they've still got that long lineage and strong connection. The rest of it is we have to say sorry and mean it.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is in terms of community and public health broadly, I mean, you can define community in lots of different ways, but often people talk about communities of interest, communities of identity, or communities of place. right? All of which can apply in different things. So community of interest can be on a like Melbourne City Football Club or big, Storm in Rob's case. That's right. You're like, you've got a community of interest.
They haven't won a game for 5-6 years now.
You can have a community of interest, you can have a community of place, i.e. where you live, where you work, whichever, and you can have a community of identity, things that you identify with. Sorry, that's identity is your supporting AFL club, right? That's my community of identity. Community of interest is we're all lawyers. We're all physicians, public health physicians, you have shared identity. Now, people will mobilise, or we can activate mobilisation on those things, right? So if, for example, in Latrobe, there was a big open cast mine fire, huge community concern with the consequences of that fire, people rallied around that point, made a very big and loud noise that couldn't not be heard by government, so a lot of action flowed from that. If you've got a community of interest, or identity, such as Aboriginal Victorians or Aboriginal people, or Aboriginal Torres Strait Island people more broadly, you can rally with that. One of the challenges in prevention more broadly is that it's a very abstract value proposition. We want to improve population health. Well, we get it because we're thinking about it from a science and a population perspective. But if you're trying to engage community, that's a pretty abstract value proposition. Often our value propositions need to be much more honed to those issues of place, identity and interest in order to get people really engaged and owning that agenda. That's not to say that it doesn't work. If that broader value proposition didn't work, then we wouldn't have action on climate change. Because people mostly aren't engaged on the climate change issues because it is literally impacting their business. I mean, some people are, but it's a huge political issue. It's got massive mainstream support, far outweighing the politicians who are actually the outliers on that issue in terms of their behaviour and their beliefs. But the majority of people get it. They want to see change. Why? Because they live on the planet. Our interest is we're human beings living on a planet at that point, right? But it's easier often to mobilise around a much more specific concern, and you'll get really better buy-in then.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Rob and Bruce. Fascinating discussion.